Good evening. This is Atheist History Week, and I'm John Rafferty, President of the Secular Humanist Society of New York, and also a proud and active member of New York City Atheists, which produces this show. Every week at this time, we look at the week's anniversaries in the history of free thought, of atheism, agnosticism, skepticism, rationalism, whatever you have ism, humanism, by all means. We discuss notable people, the famous, the not so famous, and sometimes even the infamous, who were born or died or achieved something, accomplished something perhaps in this week in history, roughly this week. Sometimes we spread the, extend the parameters of the week. And we look also at religious fun and games that happened during this week in history, burnings at the stake, pogroms, expulsions, the usual stuff that is associated with faith-based initiatives. We ought to start this evening's look at this week in atheist history with William Pitt. And William Pitt was born in November, on November 15th in 1708. He was a statesman in Great Britain, educated at Eton and Oxford, entered Parliament at a very young age of 27, and became known as the Great Commoner, and was singled out by his peers as almost the definition of honesty. That honesty got him into trouble during the American Revolution because he told King George, "You cannot conquer the Americans." So the king subsequently called Pitt a trumpet of sedition. But of course he was proven right. By the way, the city of Pittsburgh is named for William Pitt, who had a great reputation during his lifetime for promoting the rights and the interests of the so-called lower classes in Great Britain, for American independence, and for his own personal honesty. In terms of his personal honesty, one of the things that was impossible to do in England at the time was come out as an outright atheist, and he probably wasn't. He called for, in his private writings, a religion of reason, as opposed to what he called superstitious fear of God. He called for simple fear of God without the nonsense of organized religion. Let's go back even further in history to 1647, and the date being November 18th, and one of history's great skeptics and the father of the Enlightenment, many historians call him, Pierre Bayle, was born in southern France. The son of a Protestant minister who was at a time when Huguenots, the Protestants in France, were being severely persecuted. The Protestant schools were closed, so he went to a Jesuit school for his education and almost converted to Catholicism. But he didn't. And under the rules in France at the time, that meant he was a relapse. The worst thing that you could be in Catholic French society at the time, meaning you relapsed away from Catholicism. That was terrible. That was really bad. Bad enough if you were a Protestant, but if you had been a Catholic and then relapsed, forget it. You were in big trouble. So he nipped off to Calvinist Geneva in Switzerland, where he became a professor of philosophy, and he spent most of the rest of his life, even though he wrote in French, spent most of the rest of his life outside of France. He campaigned for, in all his writings, for reason, and which was the inheritance, of course, of René Descartes, but he nevertheless campaigned on his own against, I should say, conversion by force, whether conversion to Catholicism in France or conversion to Protestantism in England, for instance. One of the reasons why he liked to live in the Netherlands, where neither of these were done. He was the first to argue in public life for complete religious toleration and freedom of conscience, including for Jews, Muslims, and atheists. He quipped that he was a literal Protestant, protesting everything. His friends called him a secret atheist. Atheism would get your head cut off for you in those days, pretty much anywhere, maybe not in the Netherlands. He actually never left the Calvinist church, but as I say, his friends called him secret atheist. Going to church provided him a little bit of protection from the authorities. But he wrote, "It is pure illusion to think that an opinion which passes down from century to century to century, from generation to generation, may not be entirely false." Called the father of the Enlightenment, his writings were eagerly read by his philosophical inheritor, François-Marie Arouet, better known as Voltaire, who was born on November 21st in 1694. And became, of course, the, can I call it, spiritual leader of the Enlightenment. Voltaire, again, another one, Jesuit educated, because that was what there was in France at the time. He started writing clever verses by the time he was 12, and in his early 20s, he launched a successful playwriting career. He was probably the wittiest man of his time, but however, his wit got him in trouble, got him thrown in prison a few times, and after the second one, he started writing under the pen name Voltaire to keep himself out of prison when the authorities didn't like what he wrote. So, he too, was, of course, was a direct inheritor of René Descartes, but he didn't buy into Descartes' famous wager about the existence of God. And he wrote, "The interest I have in believing a thing is not a proof of the existence of that thing." He continued writing. He was most famously for his own argument against the existence of God, or certainly the existence of a benevolent God, was the earthquake that destroyed Lisbon in 1755. 15,000 people died in that earthquake, and another 15,000 were injured. And Voltaire wrote a poem of the Lisbon earthquake. But how conceive a God supremely good, who heaps his favors on the sons he loves, yet scatters evil with as large a hand? Of course, that earthquake figures also in Voltaire's most famous novel, Candide, when Candide, the young man, Candide's tutor, Pangloss, Dr. Pangloss, says that, argues that the earthquake in Lisbon that killed 15,000 people is proof of the goodness of God, because everything that God does is for the good, because this is the best possible world. This is the best of all possible worlds. That alone would have gotten Voltaire's head cut off if he wasn't living in Geneva, where the religious authorities were just as terrible as the Catholic authorities back in France. But as long as Voltaire was attacking the Catholic Church, okay. Christianity, nevertheless, Voltaire called that infamous thing, the most ridiculous, the most absurd and bloody religion that has ever infected the world. Matter of fact, for the rest of his life, he signed every personal letter. He ended every personal letter that he wrote with "Écraser l'infâme," crush the infamy, the Christian religion. While Candide was his most famous book, the one that had the most effect was his Philosophical Dictionary, published in 1764. First edition sold out immediately. Of course, in Geneva, the officials had it burned. Even in the Netherlands, it was burned. Certainly in Paris, it was burned. And Voltaire, this only stirred him to write and act even more fiercely, more vigorously against these civil atrocities which were committed in the name of religion. Just an idea of what happened at the time, the thing that drove him nuts, that infuriated him, as it would you. A young man, a 19-year-old young man, the Chevalier de la Barre. He was sentenced to death for blasphemy. What was his blasphemy? During a religious procession going by in the street, he did not remove his hat. Sentenced to death. He was beheaded after being tortured. Then his body was burned along with a copy of Voltaire's Philosophical Dictionary. This was what he campaigned against. This was the world in which he lived. It boggles the mind to even think that the world was organized at one point, or at least Western civilization was organized at one point along lines like this. Of course, the French very soon realized what a great man he was. His statue was erected in the Pantheon, which is the repository of the greats of France. Unfortunately, during the Nazi occupation, the Nazis, during the Second World War, the Nazis took down his statue and melted it. Why? One can only wonder what the Nazis might conceivably have had against Voltaire. Again, some just random quotes. That common sense is not so common. That atheism is the vice of a few intelligent people. That there are no sects, S-E-C-T-S, in geometry. That sect and error are synonymous. The truths of a religion are never so well understood as by those who have lost the power of reasoning. If you can no longer reason, you will understand religion. That's Voltaire. And in November of 1866, on the 17th, as a matter of fact, in Leslie, Michigan, a dainty baby girl was born who was christened Voltairine de Clare because her father was a great admirer of Voltaire. Voltaire, as she was called later on in life, taught herself to read by the age of 4, and her father later on got religion and sent her to a convent in Ontario to be educated, where, as she wrote, I suffered hell 1,000 times while I was wondering where it was located. The convent turned her into a freethinker and someone who decided that her life was in public service and on a broader stage than Leslie, Michigan. She quickly threw herself into the fray. She very quickly became the editor of the Progressive Age in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and launched a lecture tour where she spoke to free thought groups. Very, very beautiful woman who lectured while wearing a Greek toga. She made quite an impression. Emma Goldman wrote about her after Voltaire died. She said that her pale face lit up with the inner fire of her ideal, and her speeches were richly studded with original thought. In 1887, after the Haymarket bombing, 4 innocent anarchists were executed, as there is no question, they were railroaded. And at the time, most thinking people knew it. And Voltaire's life was changed at this point, and she became an advocate for anarchism and feminism, and became fiercer and fiercer in her denunciation of the church and of the government that would put people, innocent people, to death. In 1902, a deranged former pupil shot her 4 times at close range. She was expected to die, but she lived, and she went on lecturing and continued her work until she finally died in 1912. A hero of the free thought movement in America. The question of souls is old, she wrote. We demand our bodies now. We are tired of promises. God is deaf, and his church is our worst enemy. We spoke last week about Jawaharlal Nehru of India, and this week we're going to talk about his daughter, Indira Gandhi. Who was born on November 19th in 1917 and went on to become the Prime Minister of India, just as her father had been. He was the first. She got the usual Indian upper-class education in England at Oxford. She joined the independence movement. She married one of the Congress Party militants, Feroz Gandhi, but her marriage fell apart after her father became prime minister, and he asked her to be his official hostess, the sort of first lady. So her marriage pretty much fell apart. She became a leader of the Congress Party and served in Parliament. And when the Congress Party won the elections in 1967, she became Prime Minister, the first woman leader of a major country in modern times. Indira Gandhi was a free thinker without question. She was also a politician, so she didn't come straight out with atheism or even agnosticism, something that you can't do in a nation of hundreds of millions of God-fearers. But she did write or in an interview, she once said that there exists no politician in India daring enough to attempt to explain to the masses that cows can be eaten. Indira Gandhi is also an exemplar of the caveat. This is Atheist Week in History, and we do talk about atheists, but Indira Gandhi is an exemplar that not every atheist is an unqualified good guy. And when she lost an election, because her 1971 election was determined by the Supreme Court in India that the election had been illegitimate, she declared a state of emergency, took everything, became a dictator, and she ruled with an iron fist. She waged a war against Pakistan. Good thing they won, not the Pakistanis, but okay. She got herself in the middle of Sikh and Hindu riots that were going on, and eventually some Sikh, S-I-K-H, Sikh bodyguards who were supposed to be protecting her were Sikh fundamentalists, and they gunned her down in her own garden in New Delhi. A free thinker, probably an agnostic, possibly an atheist, and an important figure in the 20th century, and as we said, the first leader of a major country, great feminist role model. On the other hand, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. When she got it, she wouldn't let go of it, and it eventually killed her. Also in India, but a little bit earlier, in 1902, on November 15th, was born India's atheist leader, Gora. One name, Gora. He was born into a high-caste Hindu family, but like other atheists, he hated the caste system, and he campaigned to abolish the caste system that, with its untouchables and its ideas of karma and fate, which kept many, many generations of Indians locked into a system whereby no progress ever happened. He was excommunicated by his family at a very early age for his atheism. In 1940, he and his wife founded the Atheist Center in India, in a small village, and he wrote many, many books. He was an agitator who worked to abolish child marriages, to provide aid to the possibly millions of prostitutes in India, because if a marriage couldn't be arranged, the only thing a woman could possibly do in those days in India was sell her own body, to provide aid to prostitutes, to unwed mothers and other vulnerable women. He campaigned all over rural India against god men who would do, the walking on the fire and the snake charming and all that, and the baloney about, bleeding from the eyes, all of the nonsense that went on and still goes on in India. Gora, atheist leader of India, born in 1902 on November 15th, and lived until 1975. And on November 19th, just a couple of years earlier, in 1962, Jodie Foster was she graduated magna cum laude from Yale with a degree in literature in 1985. She's won 2 Academy Awards for Best Actress, and her many movies include Contact And about that movie, she wrote, absolutely believe what Ellie Arroway, the atheist astronomer in that movie Contact, I absolutely believe what Ellie believes, that there is no direct evidence, so how could you ask me to believe in God when there's absolutely no evidence that I can see? I do believe in the beauty and the awe-inspiring mystery of the science that's out there and that we haven't discovered yet, that there are scientific explanations for phenomena that we will call mystical because we don't know any better.
Whatever we once were, we are no longer a Christian nation, at least not just. We are also a Jewish nation, a Muslim nation, and a Buddhist nation, and a Hindu nation, and a nation of non-believers.